Sir, I'm going to need you to pull over to the inspection area and turn off the engine. The voice that came through the driver's side window was young, crisp, and saturated with the kind of authority that comes from a freshly pressed uniform and the weight of a sidearm. The old Ford F-150, a relic from a bygone decade, coughed and sputtered as if in protest before the engine died with a shudder. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the prairie wind whistling around the imposing concrete barriers of the main gate at Vandenberg Air Force Base. The truck, with its faded blue paint peeling back to reveal patches of primer and rust, looked like a tired old animal that had wandered away from its pasture and found itself in a world of steel and surveillance cameras. Its bed was empty save for a few stray pieces of hay and the ghost of dirt from 1,000 country roads. Inside, the man behind the wheel didn't move immediately. His hands, thick-knuckled and mapped with the lines of a long life spent working the earth, rested on the cracked steering wheel. He wore a plaid shirt, the colors softened by countless washes, and a pair of worn denim jeans. He wasn't looking at the young airman who stood impatiently by his door, but past him, towards the manicured lawns and stark, functional buildings of the base that stretched out under the vast California sky. He seemed to be looking for something that wasn't there anymore. Or maybe, something that had been there all along, hidden beneath the modern facade. Finally, he turned his head. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held a quiet depth. They didn't show fear or annoyance, just a kind of patient weariness. "Of course, son," he said, his voice a low rumble, like gravel turning over. "Whatever you need." The young airman, Calloway, couldn't have been more than 20. He had that ramrod posture that basic training drills into you, a posture that hasn't yet been softened by the realities of long watches and bureaucratic nonsense. He saw the old man, the ancient truck, the faint smell of soil and livestock, and his mind, trained to categorize threats and anomalies, filed it all under nuisance. A local farmer, probably lost. Or worse, a protester trying some new, pathetic tactic. License and registration. Calloway snapped, his hand resting near the butt of his pistol, a gesture that was more habit than genuine concern. The old man, whose name on the faded license was Samuel Crow, moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace. There was no fumbling. His hand went to the glove box, retrieved a worn leather pouch, and produced the documents with an economy of motion that was almost unsettling. It was too smooth. Calloway took the papers, his eyes scanning them with practiced efficiency. Everything was in order. Samuel Crow, age 78. Address was a rural route number miles east of Lompoc. "What's your business at Vandenberg, Mr. Crow?" Calloway asked, his tone still sharp, accusatory. He was enjoying this, the simple black-and-white clarity of his authority at the gate. It was a stark contrast to the gray ambiguities of the world outside these fences. "I'm here to visit the memorial," Crow said softly. His gaze drifted again towards the heart of the base. "The K-9 Memorial," Calloway almost laughed. "The dog memorial?" "Sir, that's on the far side of the base. It's not exactly a public tourist attraction. Access is restricted. I know where it is," Crow replied, his voice unchanged. "I was told to check in at the main gate." Another airman, a woman with a severe haircut and a clipboard, walked over. "Problem, Calloway?" "Got a farmer here says he wants to see the dog cemetery," Calloway said, a smirk playing on his lips. He lowered his voice slightly. "Probably got his prize-winning pig buried there." The female airman didn't crack a smile. "Does he have authorization? Is he on the access roster?" Calloway scanned his screen. "Negative. No Crow, no appointment. Nothing." He handed the license and registration back through the window. "Sorry, sir. Like I said, restricted access. You'll have to turn around. This is a secure military installation." Samuel Crow took the papers, his fingers brushing against Calloway's. For a split second, Calloway felt the texture of the old man's skin. It was rougher than sandpaper, calloused in ways that spoke of a lifetime of hard, physical labor. But there was a stillness in the man's hand, a complete lack of tremor that was unusual for someone his age. Crow didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply nodded, his pale eyes holding Calloway's for a moment longer than was comfortable. In that gaze, Calloway felt a flicker of something he couldn't name. Not anger, not pleading, but a profound and ancient stillness. It was like looking into a deep well. "I understand," Crow said, He put the documents back in the leather pouch and placed his hands back on the steering wheel. But he didn't start the truck. He just sat there, breathing slowly, his chest rising and falling in a steady, measured rhythm. It was the breathing of a man waiting for a storm to pass. Or perhaps, the breathing of a man who was the storm itself. Calloway's patience, already thin, snapped. This old man's passive resistance was more infuriating than any outright defiance. It was a quiet challenge to his authority, a refusal to be dismissed so easily. "Sir, did you hear me? I said you need to leave." Now he tapped his knuckles on the truck's roof, the sound a sharp, metallic rap in the quiet air. "Or I'll have you escorted." Samuel Crow's eyes didn't waver. "The thing is, son," he began, his voice still low and even, "I can't leave. Not yet." This was it. The moment Calloway had been trained for. Noncompliance. A potential threat. His posture straightened even further, his hand moving from resting on his weapon to gripping it. "Is that a threat, sir?" The question was formulaic, a line from a script he'd rehearsed 100 times. "No," Crow said, a faint, sad smile touching his lips for the first time. "It's a promise. I made it a long time ago." This was too much for Calloway. The cryptic nonsense, the calm refusal. He was done playing games. He keyed his radio. "Sentry 2 to gate control. I have a non-compliant civilian at the main gate, refusing to vacate. Requesting K-9 support for a vehicle sweep." It was an escalation, and he knew it. A K-9 unit was for bomb or drug searches, not for stubborn old farmers. But it was a show of force, a way to put the fear of God into this man and get him off his checkpoint. Let him see what real power looked like. He wanted to see the old man flinch, to see that unnerving calm finally break. From his vantage point, Calloway could see the man's hands on the wheel. They hadn't moved. They were as steady as the hills in the distance. The man's breathing was still slow and deep, a stark contrast to Calloway's own, which was becoming shallow and quick with adrenaline. A few minutes later, a specialized patrol vehicle rolled up, parking behind Crow's truck and boxing it in. The doors opened and Sergeant Reyes stepped out, a man whose easy, rolling gait couldn't quite disguise the coiled readiness beneath. At his side, leashed but vibrating with contained energy, was Thor, a magnificent Belgian Malinois. The dog was a sleek engine of muscle and instinct, its coat the color of sable, its black mask giving it a look of fierce intelligence. Thor was the base's top explosives detection dog, a creature of profound discipline and singular focus. Sergeant Reyes was all business, his eyes taking in the scene. The beat-up truck, the old farmer, Calloway's rigid stance. "What's the situation, Airman?" Reyes asked, his voice calm and professional. He had a decade of experience on Calloway, and it showed. "Civilian refuses to leave the checkpoint, Sergeant," Calloway reported, trying to sound as official as possible. "He's being evasive. I want his vehicle searched," Reyes nodded, his gaze settling on Samuel Crow, who was now watching the dog with an intensity that hadn't been there before. The old man's weary patience had been replaced by a sharp, focused attention. His eyes weren't on the handler, but solely on the animal. "All right, sir," Reyes said, his voice polite but firm as he addressed Crow. "We're just going to run my partner around your truck. Standard procedure. Please keep your hands where I can see them." Crow didn't answer. He just watched the dog. Reyes gave a quiet command, and Thor went to work. The dog was a professional, moving with a fluid, practiced grace. He started at the front bumper, his nose twitching, taking in the world in a way no human ever could. He swept along the passenger side, his tail held in a neutral position, his focus absolute. Calloway stood back, arms crossed, a triumphant look on his face. This would be over in minutes. The old man would be humiliated and sent on his way. But then, something strange happened. As Thor rounded the back of the truck and came along the driver's side, his entire demeanor changed. The transformation in the dog was instantaneous and profound. One moment, Thor was a disciplined military asset performing a routine task. The next, he was something else entirely. As his nose came level with the open driver's side window, he stopped dead. His body went rigid, his ears shot forward, and a low whine escaped his throat, a sound of deep and utter confusion. It wasn't an alert for explosives. Reyes knew that signal intimately. The dog would sit, motionless, staring at the source. This was different. This was personal. Thor ignored the truck completely. His entire being was now focused on the old man sitting inside. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, until his head was inside the window, his wet nose just inches from Samuel Crow's worn jacket. The whine grew louder, more insistent, and his tail, which had been neutral, began to give a slow, tentative wag. Sergeant Reyes was stunned into silence. He'd worked with Thor for 3 years, from the time the dog was a lanky, powerful adolescent fresh from Lackland. He knew every twitch, every sound, every subtle shift in the animal's body language. He had never, not once, seen Thor behave this way with a stranger. Military working dogs were not pets. They were trained to be aloof, focused, and sometimes aggressive towards unfamiliar individuals. They did not seek affection from people outside their circle of command. Calloway, seeing the dog's strange behavior, misinterpreted it completely. "See, Sergeant, I told you something was off with this guy. The dog's got something." Reyes shot him a sharp look. "Quiet, Airman. That's not an alert." He gave the leash a gentle tug. "Thor Offson. Search." It was the command to continue, a word the dog had obeyed thousands of times without hesitation. Thor ignored it. He whined again, a heartbreaking sound, and pushed his head further into the cab, pressing it against Samuel Crow's shoulder. The old man still hadn't moved, but his eyes, which had been fixed on the dog, now closed slowly, and his steady breathing hitched for a single, fractional moment. A wave of some powerful, unspoken emotion washed over his weathered face. Reyes tugged the leash again, this time with more force. "Thor, heel." The command was sharp, authoritative. Any other day, the dog would have snapped back to his side instantly. Today, Thor resisted the pull. He braced his powerful legs and refused to budge, his attention locked on the farmer. He let out a soft, frustrated bark, as if trying to communicate something vital that his handler was failing to understand. The situation at the gate had now shifted from a minor inconvenience to a baffling spectacle. Other cars were being rerouted. More security forces were arriving, drawn by the radio chatter. They kept their distance, watching the standoff between the handler, the dog, and the silent old man in the truck. Reyes felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. A handler's greatest fear is losing control of his dog. It was a failure of training, a failure of the bond. But this wasn't a loss of control in the way he'd been trained to expect. Thor wasn't being aggressive or disobedient in a defiant way. He was acting devoted. He was acting as if he had found something he had been searching for his entire life. Calloway stepped forward, his hand once again on his weapon. "Sergeant, your dog is out of control. We need to secure this individual." "Back off, Calloway," Reyes snapped, his voice tight. "Let me handle my dog." He knelt down, trying to get eye level with Thor, to break the strange spell the old man seemed to have cast. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, his voice soft. "What is it? What do you smell?" Thor turned his head for a second, gave Reyes's face a quick lick, and then immediately turned back to Crow, pressing against the truck's door with his full weight, refusing to be moved. It was then that Samuel Crow finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, he raised one of his calloused hands from the steering wheel. He didn't reach for the dog. He simply held his hand out, palm up, in the space inside the cab. He said nothing. The gesture was an invitation, a question asked in a language older than words. Thor responded instantly. He pulled his head out of the window and began to pace back and forth along the length of the driver's side door, his whining escalating, his body trembling with a strange, frantic energy. He pawed at the door, scratching the faded paint, desperate to get closer. He wasn't trying to attack. He was trying to get in. Reyes was at a complete loss. He had run Thor through every imaginable scenario. Crowds, gunfire, explosions, hostile actors. Nothing had ever broken his focus like this. The dog was acting like a long-lost pet who had just found its owner. And that was impossible. Samuel Crow watched the dog's frantic display, his face a mask of profound sorrow and something that looked like recognition. He finally turned his gaze from the animal to the baffled handler kneeling on the asphalt. "He's a good dog," Crow said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the tense silence. "You've trained him well." Reyes, still struggling with Thor's leash, looked up, bewildered. A compliment on his training was the last thing he expected. "I don't understand," Reyes said, his professionalism cracking. "He's never done this. Ever. It's not your training," Crow said. "It's his blood. It remembers, he paused, his pale eyes finding Reyes's. May I step out of the vehicle? Slowly, the request hung in the air. Calloway immediately tensed. Negative. Stay in the vehicle. Reyes, however, saw something else. He saw the way the dog was reacting, the way the old man was speaking. This wasn't a standard security threat. This was something else, something that wasn't in any of his manuals. He made a split-second decision that went against protocol, but followed his gut. Hold your position, Calloway, Reyes commanded, his authority ringing clear. He looked at Crow. Okay, sir. Slowly. Both hands out where I can see them, Samuel Crow nodded. He opened the creaking door of the F-150 with one hand, keeping the other visible. He swung his legs out, his movements stiff with age but still possessing that strange, underlying economy. He planted his worn work boots on the ground and stood up. He was taller than he looked sitting down, his frame stooped but broad. The moment Crow was out of the truck, Thor stopped his frantic pacing. He went silent, his body quivering. He pulled against the leash, not with frantic force now, but with an inexorable, powerful certainty, his entire focus on the old man. Reyes, expecting the dog to jump or bark, was surprised when Thor simply walked forward until he was standing directly in front of Crow. The dog sat down, looked up at the old farmer's face, and let out a single, soft woof. It was a sound of greeting, of acknowledgement. And then, the highly trained, multi-thousand-dollar military asset lay down, put his head on Samuel Crow's dusty boots, and closed his eyes. The entire gate complex fell silent. The wind, the distant hum of base machinery, the crackle of radios, it all faded away. Everyone stared at the impossible sight. The formidable military working dog, a creature trained for aggression and precision, lying peacefully at the feet of a random old farmer as if he were its master. Calloway's jaw was slack with disbelief. Sergeant Reyes felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't training. This wasn't a fluke. This was something primal. Crow looked down at the dog for a long moment. Then, very slowly, he bent down, his old joints protesting, and rested a hand on Thor's head. He didn't speak. He just kept his hand there, his thumb gently stroking the dog's ear. After a moment, he looked up at Reyes. Belgian Malinois, Crow stated. It wasn't a question. Lineage out of the Netherlands, I'd guess. Camp PV lines. Heavy prey drive. Smart as a whip. A little neurotic if you don't keep him busy. The detail was staggering. He wasn't just identifying the breed. He was identifying the specific working lineage, the temperament, the psychological needs of the animal, all from a few moments of observation. Reyes could only nod, speechless. How did you know that? Reyes finally managed to ask. And how are you doing this? Crow's hand never stopped its gentle motion on the dog's head. I'm not doing anything, Sergeant. He is. He smells home. He then did something that broke every rule of interaction with a strange working dog. He knelt down completely, bringing his face close to Thor's. He didn't speak English. He made a series of soft clicks with his tongue and a low, guttural whistle, sounds that were more animal than human. Thor's ears twitched. He opened his eyes, lifted his head, and licked the old man's chin. Reyes felt like the world had tilted on its axis. Those sounds, they weren't just random noises. He'd read about them in old, declassified training manuals from the Vietnam era. They were part of an experimental program, a handler language designed to be undetectable by human enemies in the jungle. A program that had been shut down decades ago. A program whose handlers were all thought to be dead or lost to history. Project Water Shadow, Reyes whispered, the name feeling alien on his tongue. He had read about it in a historical monograph at the K-9 training school at Lackland. It was a footnote in the history of military working dogs, a highly classified unit of handlers and dogs dropped into Laos and Cambodia in the late 60s. They were tasked with silent reconnaissance, tracking, and assassination. They used a unique, non-verbal command system. The program was officially a failure, with most of the teams lost in action. The records were sealed, the stories buried. Samuel Crow's head snapped up. His pale blue eyes, which had been soft and sad, were suddenly sharp as ice. The placid farmer was gone, and in his place was someone else, someone far more dangerous. Where did you hear that name? He asked, his voice no longer a gentle rumble, but a hard, flat command. The authority in it was absolute. It made the hair on Reyes's arms stand up. Reyes, a sergeant in the United States Air Force, found himself instinctively straightening up, as if in the presence of a superior officer. In a book, sir, at the training academy. It was just a historical mention. Most of it was redacted. Crow's gaze held him for a moment longer, assessing, before the hardness receded, replaced again by that profound weariness. He looked back down at the dog. They wrote books about it. He shook his head slowly. We were just ghosts. We weren't supposed to be remembered. The pieces were clicking into place in Reyes's mind with the force of a rifle bolt sliding home. The old man's calm under pressure, his economy of motion, his unnerving stillness, his intimate knowledge of the dog, the lost, nonverbal language. This wasn't just a farmer. This was one of them, one of the originals, a founding father of a world Reyes only knew through sanitized training manuals. The memorial, Reyes said, his voice full of a dawning, overwhelming respect. You're not just here to see it. You're part of it. My partner is on that wall, Crow said, his voice thick with emotion for the first time. A Malinois, just like this one. Looked just like him. His name was Stryker. We spent 4 years together, most of it in places you wouldn't find on any map. He saved my life more times than I can count. I saved his a few times, too. He finally took his hand off Thor and slowly, painfully, got back to his feet. Thor whined at the loss of contact, but remained lying down, watching him. The last time I saw him, Crow continued, his eyes focused on something 1,000 miles and 50 years away. We were on a riverbank. We got hit hard. I was wounded, couldn't move. He laid on top of me, took 2 rounds meant for me. He died right there. The story fell into the quiet space between them. It was a story of a debt that could never be repaid, a ghost that had walked with him for half a century. They told me they couldn't recover his body, Crow said, his voice raw. But a few years ago, I got a letter from an old friend, someone from the program who went on to become a general. He told me they eventually did, that they'd created a memorial here for all the K-9s lost in action, and that Stryker's name was on it. He sent me a pass, told me to come anytime. But it's taken me until now to be able to. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a worn, creased piece of paper. It was an old, official-looking letter with a general's letterhead, dated 5 years prior. It was a standing invitation. He had just never used it. Calloway, who had been standing by, utterly silent and pale, now looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. The smirking arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep and profound shame. He had called this man a nuisance. He had threatened a living legend. He finally understood the man's earlier words. I can't leave. Not yet. It's a promise. It was a promise to a fallen comrade. By now, the commotion had drawn the attention of the gate's shift commander, a young captain who came striding over, his face a mask of annoyance. Sergeant Reyes, what in the hell is going on here? Why is this area not clear? Reyes stood up and turned, blocking the captain's view of Crow. He came to attention. Sir, a situation has developed. He quietly explained what had happened. The dog's reaction, the old training language, the name of the project. The captain's face went from annoyed to incredulous, and then to something approaching awe. He peered around Reyes at the old farmer, who was now just standing quietly, his hands at his sides, looking tired. The captain was young, an academy graduate who knew military history. He knew what Project Water Shadow signified. It was the stuff of myth, whispered about by special operations historians. To have one of its members standing at his gate was like having a Roman legionary show up for a tour of the Pentagon. The captain walked past Reyes and came to a halt in front of Samuel Crow. He looked at the old man's worn clothes, his calloused hands, and his tired eyes. Then he did something that made Calloway's breath catch in his throat. He snapped to the sharpest, most respectful salute of his life. Sir, the captain said, his voice tight with emotion. It is an honor to have you at our base. Please, allow me to escort you personally. The shift in atmosphere at the main gate was seismic. Radios crackled with a new urgency, but the tone was entirely different. It wasn't about a threat anymore. It was about honoring a guest. The base commander was notified, his schedule instantly cleared. The security jeep that had been a symbol of intimidation was now offered as a respectful transport. Samuel Crow, however, just shook his head gently. Thank you, Captain, but I prefer to drive my own truck. If that's all right. He looked at his old Ford with a kind of quiet affection. It was a piece of his life, his identity as a farmer, the man he had become after the ghost in the jungle had been laid to rest. Driving it onto the base felt right. The captain simply nodded. "Of course, sir. Anything you need." He turned to Reyes. "Sergeant, you and your partner will provide an escort." "Yes, sir," Reyes said, a swell of pride in his chest. He gave Thor's leash a little slack. The dog got to its feet and immediately moved to Crow's side, pressing against his leg, assuming a natural healing position as if they had been partners for years. The bond was there, an echo in the bloodline, a genetic memory passed down through generations of carefully bred working dogs. Crow, Reyes, and Thor were a team, formed in an instant across a 50-year gap. The convoy that drove onto Vandenberg Air Force Base was one for the history books. In the lead was the security forces patrol car, its lights now off. Behind it was the ancient, sputtering Ford F-150, driven by the old farmer. And walking proudly alongside the driver's side door, unleashed now at Crow's quiet request, was Thor, the base's top military dog, his head held high, his gait a perfect match to the slow rumble of the truck's engine. Sergeant Reyes rode in the passenger seat of the truck, the silence between him and Crow comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. Calloway was left back at the gate, watching them go, the lesson of his young life burning in his gut. He had mistaken humility for weakness and silence for ignorance. He had judged the book by its weathered, dirt-stained cover and had missed the epic written inside. It was a mistake he would never make again. He looked down at his own crisp uniform and for the first time felt the weight of the history it represented, a history embodied by the old farmer in the rusty truck. They drove through the sprawling base, past satellite dishes that looked to the heavens and missile silos that slept beneath the earth. It was a world of high technology and immense power, yet its most profound secret had just been revealed by the instinct of a dog and the quiet dignity of an old man. The K-9 Memorial was in a quiet, secluded part of the base, a small, grassy field shaded by oak trees. It was a peaceful place. Rows of simple granite markers stood in silent tribute. Each one bore the name of a dog, its years of service, and a short epitaph. These were not pets. They were soldiers who had walked on four legs. They had sniffed out bombs in Afghanistan, found drugs on the border, and died protecting their handlers in places the world would never know about. The captain and a few other base personnel kept a respectful distance as Crow's truck pulled to a stop. Samuel Crow got out, his movements even slower now, as if the proximity to this place was a heavy weight. Thor stayed right with him, a living, breathing shadow. Reyes walked with them, feeling like he was treading on sacred ground. Crow walked slowly down the rows, his eyes scanning the names carved into the stone. He passed names from recent conflicts, Rex, Bella, Diesel, and names from older ones. Then he stopped. He stood before a small, gray marker, weathered by the sun and sea air. The name carved into it was simple, Stryker. Below it, the dates of service, 1968 to 1972. The epitaph read, Semper Fidelis Canis, always a faithful dog. Crow reached out and traced the letters of the name with his rough fingers. He didn't weep. His shoulders didn't shake. He just stood there, his body utterly still, his head bowed. Thor, sensing the depth of the moment, sat beside him, leaning his weight against the old man's leg, offering comfort in the only way he knew how. The dog let out a soft, low whine, a sound of shared grief that echoed across the years. For a long time, the only sound was the wind in the oak trees and the quiet, steady breathing of the man and the dog. Reyes felt like he was a witness to something holy, a final debriefing between partners separated by a lifetime. He was watching a debt of honor finally being paid. After what felt like an eternity, Crow straightened up. He turned to Reyes, his eyes clear. "He was the best I ever saw," he said, his voice thick but steady. "These dogs, they give everything. They don't ask for medals or parades. They just ask for our trust and a chance to do their work. We owe them more than we can ever repay." He looked at Thor, who was looking back up at him, his brown eyes full of intelligence and devotion. "You have a good partner, Sergeant. You honor his bloodline." "I will, sir," Reyes said, his voice choked with emotion. "I understand that now more than ever." Crow gave a small, sad smile. He then knelt down one last time and put his arms around Thor's neck, burying his face in the dog's thick fur. He stayed like that for a full minute, a silent, final goodbye to one partner and a greeting to another. When he stood up, he seemed lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He had closed a circle that had been open for 50 years. He had kept his promise. He was ready to go home. The drive back to the main gate was just as quiet. As they approached, Crow could see the figure of Airman Calloway, standing ramrod straight by the checkpoint. The young man wasn't smirking now. His face was grim, respectful. As the old truck rumbled to a stop, Calloway stepped forward and rendered a salute, as sharp and precise as the one the captain had given. Crow simply nodded at him from behind the wheel, a gesture of acknowledgement, perhaps even forgiveness. The dismissal had been forgotten, replaced by a hard-earned lesson in respect. Reyes got out of the truck, with Thor hopping out after him. The dog looked from Reyes to Crow, a look of confusion on his face, not wanting the pack to break up. "It's okay, boy," Crow said softly through the open window. "You go with your handler. He's a good man. You take care of him." He then looked at Reyes. "Thank you, Sergeant." "For understanding, no, sir," Reyes said, his hand resting on Thor's head. "Thank you for everything." Samuel Crow put the old truck in gear. With a final nod, he drove away from the gate, leaving the world of steel and secrets behind him. He drove back toward his quiet farm, toward the life he had built over the ghosts of his past. Back at the gate, Reyes and Calloway stood watching until the rusty F-150 disappeared over the horizon, a fading speck of blue against the golden California hills. Thor sat at Reyes's feet, his eyes still fixed on the road where the old man had gone, letting out one last, soft whine. He had smelled home, a scent carried in the blood, a legacy of courage and loyalty that time could not erase. And for the men who wore the uniform, the memory of the old farmer and his impossible connection to the dog would become a quiet legend, a reminder that the greatest heroes are often the ones who walk in silence, their stories known only to the wind and to the faithful hearts of the dogs who walked beside them.